Hi, I thought I'd give you a rundown on the Caribou that I flew in the Air Force, and we're sitting in the cockpit at the moment with me in the left-hand seat. That's the pilot seat, and I thought I'd show you some of the instruments and what they are and how they work. So starting from the left-hand seat, the controls, which are here with my left hand, it was flown with the left hand, and the throttles are on the right hand, which are up above me here. It was a entirely manually flown aeroplane. It never had an autopilot the entire time it was in service with the RAF, so it had to be hand flown 100% of the time. So we used to share the flying, and as a result we used to do about half each during the any given sector. The actual layout of the instruments in front of me, entirely conventional analog type of instruments, and as a result there's nothing like you see in modern aeroplanes today. All clockwork dials. Left hand side over here was all the basic flight instruments. The centre section was all the engine instruments, and down below in between was all the navigation and radio equipment. The aeroplane was a little bit unconventional in that it had the throttles and engine controls in the roof, which are up above me in the middle here, and also the undercarriage lever was also up there as well. So when the aeroplane was flown, you actually had your hands up high, flying in this position here, which is unconventional compared with aeroplanes today. The actual instruments down here showed you all the engine controls, left and right for left engine and right engine, and the radios and navigation, which were all old-fashioned analog, so pre-GPS days, and they were all in a centre console which was controlled all your navigation and radio instruments there. There were 4 radios in the aeroplane because you're working with the Army, so you had VHF, UHF, HF long range, and also FM radio for working with the Army on the ground. So again, that was a little bit unconventional. The Caribou was a light utility transport designed by de Havilland Canada. First flew in 1958, was ordered by the RAF in 1964 with the first deliveries of the aircraft. Initial batch was 18 aircraft, and during the delivery in 1964 some of the early aircraft were diverted directly to Vietnam War, which had just started at that stage, and in fact was the RAF's first involvement in Vietnam. Subsequently they ordered more aircraft, and in the end operated a total of 29 aircraft in 2 squadrons in the Royal Australian Air Force, 35 and 38 Squadron. I was part of 38 Squadron based in Richmond, and I served there from 1976 to 1979. So the relevance of this particular aeroplane we have in the museum here, number 225, was the first aeroplane that I flew as a captain in the squadron once I got checked out on the aircraft. So it's my first command time aeroplane. So the control yoke here, the aeroplane was conventionally controlled without an autopilot, so fully manually flown the whole time. And your instruments in front of you here were the entirely conventional flight instruments, which give you attitude, airspeed, compass, vertical speed, etc. And one of the more difficult things with this aeroplane was the engine starting. These switches down here were the engine starting switches, and they were toggled left and right for starting, left engine, right engine. And you had the starter, which was the top switch, the vibrator, which gave you enhanced ignition, and in the middle, and the prime was the lower switch. Now, when you actually started the engines, you actually started the left engine first, so you had to turn your hand this way and give the starter 15 blades to turn the engine over. You then had to add the vibrator and the prime, and then when the engine fired, you actually had to take the finger off the starter and the vibrator, leave the prime on, so now you're down to 1 finger, bring the mixture up to rich, and then when you got a rich cut, you had to actually release the prime as well. All very good for the left-hand engine. When you did the right-hand engine, your fingers reversed, and you had to have the dexterity to do it in the opposite sense. So starter, vibrator, prime. When it fired, release the starter and the vibrator, leave the prime on, and again bring the mixture up till you get a rich cut, let that go. So reversing from one hand to the other meant that there were quite a few issues on starting with inexperienced pilots, which caused backfiring or not starting at all. Quite a lot of fun when you're inexperienced. Okay, engine instruments were fairly conventional. You had a thrust gauge, you had RPM with twin needles, so you had oil pressure and fuel pressure with twin needles, and the other ones were the conventional cylinder head and oil temperature, oil pressure, etc. So left side engine and right side engine here. In the middle was the emergency console, so you had things like the engine fire warnings, the propeller feathering, so where the propeller had to be shut down and feathered, and then you had other emergency things like fire warning lights and also oil shut off to prevent a fire. The other thing was the emergency brake, which is also here. I never used it in anger, but it gave you backup braking in the event of hydraulic failure. I did have one instance where I did have the hydraulics fail prior to landing in Ceduna, and the engines actually have reverse pitch on the propellers, and I had to land without flaps, without brakes, using the reverse pitch to stop the aeroplane, and then use differential power on the engines to steer the aeroplane on the ground until we got the hydraulics fixed. It turned out we had a hydraulic seal blown out on one of the pumps and dumped the entire oil reservoir